In the middle of the South Pacific, more than 3,000 kilometers from the coast of South America and over 2,000 kilometers from the nearest inhabited island, lies one of the most isolated scraps of land on the entire planet. It is a tiny volcanic triangle, barely 160 square kilometers, battered by wind and sea. And across this remote speck of earth stand nearly 1,000 giant stone figures, gazing silently inland with heavy brows and long faces. This is Rapa Nui Easter Island, and its statues, the moai, are among the most haunting monuments human beings have ever made. The largest moai that were actually raised stands several meters tall and weigh many tons. One unfinished giant still lying in the quarry would have stood over 20 meters and weighed as much as 200 tons. They were carved from compressed volcanic ash, given torsos and hands and carefully shaped faces, and then somehow transported across the island and lifted upright onto stone platforms called ahu. Many were once crowned with massive cylinders of red stone, like topknots of hair, and fitted with staring eyes of white coral. For centuries, outsiders found it almost impossible to believe that the small population living on this barren island could have created such things. Surely, some argued, they must have had help from a lost continent, from a vanished advanced race, even from visitors from the stars. But the truth is far more impressive than any of these fantasies. The moai were built by ordinary, brilliant, determined human beings, descendants of master navigators who had crossed the largest ocean on Earth. The real mystery is not who built them. It is what happened to the remarkable society that did, and why so much of it had collapsed before the wider world ever learned it existed. The story of Rapa Nui begins with one of the greatest feats of exploration in human history. Sometime around the year 1200, though some estimates run earlier, a small group of Polynesian voyagers reached the island in great double-hulled canoes. They were the descendants of an extraordinary seafaring people who, over centuries, had spread across the islands of the Pacific, navigating thousands of kilometers of open ocean using the stars, the swells, the winds, and the flight paths of birds, without compasses, charts, or instruments of any kind. To find a target as small as Easter Island in that endless blue immensity was an almost unimaginable achievement. These first settlers, perhaps only a few dozen people, brought with them the tools of Polynesian life: chickens, taro, sweet potato, banana, and whether by accident or design, the Polynesian rat. They found an island that was, at the time, very different from the windswept grassland we see today. Pollen trapped in the island's crater lakes tells us that Rapa Nui was once covered in subtropical forest, including a now extinct species of giant palm tree, the largest palm the world has ever known. From these settlers grew a thriving society. The population climbed, perhaps to many thousands at its peak. They organized themselves into clans, each controlling a stretch of territory radiating out from the coast. And at some point, this society turned its energy toward an astonishing collective project: the carving and raising of the moai. The statues are believed to represent revered ancestors, watching over and protecting the living, channeling a sacred power. Competing clans appear to have raised ever larger and grander statues, in a centuries-long contest of prestige and devotion, a spectacular flowering of culture on the loneliest island on Earth. How did a few thousand people move statues weighing dozens of tons across an entire island, without wheels, draft animals, or metal? This question has fascinated and divided researchers for generations. The carving itself happened mostly at a single volcanic quarry called Reno Raraku, where the soft compressed ash could be worked with stone handpicks. There, you can still see the entire production line frozen in time, statues in every stage of completion, some barely outlined in the rock, others fully carved but never moved, and dozens standing buried up to their shoulders in the slope, their famous heads the only part visible. As for how they were transported, the long-standing assumption was that the islanders dragged them horizontally on wooden sledges and rollers, using enormous quantities of timber and rope. But the Rapa Nui themselves preserved a different memory. Their oral tradition insisted that the moai walked to their platforms. Modern experiments have shown this may be literally true. By attaching ropes to a standing statue and rocking it from side to side while pulling, a team of people can walk an upright moai forward, step by step, much as you might shuffle a heavy refrigerator across a floor. Either way, the effort was monumental and deeply communal, requiring careful organization, surplus food, and shared belief. And it is here, in the story of how the statues moved, that the darker reading of Rapa Nui's history takes root. If the moai were dragged on rollers and sledges, then building them may have devoured the island's forests, tree by tree, statue by statue, until there was nothing left. For decades, this idea formed the heart of one of the most famous and frightening stories in all of human history, the tale of a civilization that destroyed itself. Here is the classic version of the story, the one that made Easter Island a global parable. As the population grew and the statue building competition intensified, the islanders cut down their forest faster than it could regrow. The giant palms fell to make sledges, rollers, ropes, canoes, and firewood. As the trees vanished, so did the timber needed to build ocean-going canoes, cutting the islanders off from the sea's deep-water fish. Soil washed away from the bare hillsides, and crops failed. Starvation set in. Society fractured into warfare between the clans, who turned on each other and, in their rage and despair, began to topple one another's sacred moai, pulling the ancestor gods face down into the dirt. In this telling, Rapa Nui is a chilling warning to all humanity, a closed world whose people consumed their resources until their civilization collapsed in famine and violence. It is a powerful story, but many modern archaeologists now believe it is, at the very least, badly oversimplified, and perhaps largely wrong. The deforestation was real, but the chief culprit may not have been the statue builders at all. It may have been the rats they brought with them. The Polynesian rat, with no predators on the island, could multiply explosively, and these rats ate the palm nuts, preventing the forest from regenerating. Studies of ancient palm nuts show many gnawed by rodents. And crucially, the evidence that the islanders descended into mass starvation and self-destruction is surprisingly thin. The Rapa Nui, it turns out, were remarkably resilient, adapting their farming with ingenious techniques like rock gardens that protected crops and enriched the soil. The story of ecological suicide, so satisfying as a moral lesson, may have buried the real and far crueler cause of Rapa Nui's collapse. If the islanders did not destroy themselves, then what truly broke Rapa Nui? Increasingly, the evidence points outward to the arrival of the wider world. When the first European ship reached the island on Easter Sunday of 1722, giving it the name we still use, the visitors found a functioning society and many statues still standing. The catastrophe came afterward, and it came from contact. European ships brought diseases against which the islanders had no immunity, and epidemics tore through the population. Far worse was to come. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raiders descended on Rapa Nui, kidnapping huge numbers of people, by some estimates as much as half the population, to work in mines and plantations far away. Among those seized were the island's chiefs, priests, and the keepers of its knowledge, including the only people who could read Rapa Nui's unique script, called Rongorongo, which to this day has never been deciphered. The few captives who were ever returned brought smallpox back with them, igniting yet another devastating epidemic. Within a few short years, a population that had once numbered in the thousands was reduced to barely 100 survivors. An entire library of oral history, religion, and language was almost completely erased, not by the islanders' own folly, but by raiders and disease from outside. The toppling of the last standing moai was largely completed in this shattered, post-contact world. So the real lesson of Easter Island may be very different from the one we were taught. It is not simply a story of a people who recklessly destroyed their own paradise. It is also a story of an extraordinarily resourceful civilization that survived for centuries in brutal isolation, only to be brought to the edge of extinction by forces from beyond the horizon. The moai still stand today, re-raised and watching over the grass. And the Rapa Nui people, against all odds, are still there, too, survivors of one of history's most misunderstood collapses.